Welcome to Next Gen Mentoring Forum. The Next Gen Mentoring Forum series is to empower, educate, illuminate individuals who are in or interested in financial planning professions. At each forum, an expert will discuss a topic in the field of financial planning with the purpose of inspiring critical thoughts and discussion. In today's session, I have the honor to interview Chia-Li Kratz on the topic Li like an ally. My name is Dr. Chia-Li Jian. I am an assistant professor and the director of financial planning program at California Lutheran University, and I maintain an active financial planning practice, specializing in succession program management at Value Growth Institute. I have authored 3 award-winning books. Most recent peer-reviewed research book was published by Pilgrim Macmillan, or Springer Nature. The title was Enhancing Retirement Success Rates in the United States. Next Gen Mentoring Forum is sponsored by California Lutheran University School of Management Financial Planning Program. We offer MBA in financial planning that helps financial advisors pursue a leadership position or grow their financial planning practice by deploying advanced financial planning, effective communication, financial counseling, streamlined practice management, as well as leveraging fintech. I am honored today to have Chia-Li Kratz in today's session. I met Chia-Li in Women in Financial Services National Conference in October 2020. Chia-Li is a highly acclaimed speaker and trainer who led teams and produced results in corporate America. After experiencing her own career pivot point, she developed a process for women leaders to build winning plans. Promoting gender equality in the workplace, Chia-Li is a TED Talk speaker, a frequent keynote speaker, and an executive coach. She holds an MBA from Kelley School of Business at Indiana University. She is a certified master coach. She is also a certified unconscious bias trainer. Her books include Pivot Point, How to Build a Winning Career Game. 1, How Male Allies Support Women for Gender Equality. And Lead Like an Ally, a journey through corporate America with strategies to facilitate inclusion. So welcome, Chia-Li. So nice to have you in today's session.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I thought that before we get too far out, if it's possible for you to talk specifically about how did you come to a point of having your own business, and what kind of challenge that you actually do run into. So before I start asking all kind of questions, I like to have the audience to get to know a little bit about you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I spent, the first 12 years of my career in corporate America. So I'm sure many of your audience can identify with that. Did all the things you're supposed to do and kind of check those boxes of leading people and coaching people and mentoring and helping others around me. Went back to school, got my MBA, and I wrapped up my corporate career in consulting. And it was really by way of that I had this kind of serendipitous opportunity to help women leaders develop their game plans. And so I spent a lot of time with some of my clients in the consulting space, helping women leaders kind of pivot to the next level. And I thought, wow, what if I could do this all the time? And so really paying attention to that energy and my passion for it. And really, a lot of my career had led me to that place where I could help coach women. So went again back to school, got my coaching certification, and the last 6 years I've really been developing more of a conversation about diversity, equity and inclusion in the workplace, which of course is a very hot topic in light of recent events. I think will continue to be as organizations are realizing that it's not a nice to have, it's a must have if we want to be relevant to our customers and to future employees. And so I'm really excited that I get to spend time with leaders and companies that are really, despite their best efforts, just aren't where they want to be with diversity and inclusion.
And out of and we all know that starting from kind of a side hustle all the way till a successful business, consulting business and coaching business like yours, I'm sure you run into challenges and all that. Tell us a little bit about what type of challenge do you run into and how do you overcome that?
Oh yeah, the side hustle. And that's totally fine, for people that are thinking about starting a business or, are scared about having to pay the bills out of a source of income for your own business. I was certainly there at the time when I started my business. It really came out of a coaching engagement into my own opportunity to start my own business. But for me, I had a 1 year old. I was the primary earner of my family. So it was never the ideal time. It never is. So if you're waiting for this like perfect opportunity, you'll wait forever. But I think knowing that I had enough traction and I had tried doing some of the coaching and leadership development with women, and I knew it was kind of always my calling, like what I was always most passionate about in my corporate career, getting those pieces of the puzzle together and thinking, how could I serve that purpose, right? What would that look like? And I think that's part of hanging your own shingle that you have to really define. You can't be all things to all people. You have to be crystal clear about these are the kind of companies I work with, these are the kind of problems I solve. And the more, it took a lot of iterations over the years to go from kind of that basic message to now the message I'm sharing with you today. But listening to people, listening to what resonates, being willing to flex and not take yourself too seriously in the process is really important too.
And one thing that I've noticed that you mentioned that listen to your calling, right? I think oftentimes that we are all so busy
Mhm.
that somehow we get so boxed in, we purposely ignore what the universe is telling us.
Yeah.
Could you share a little bit about what does that actually looks like when you say listening to the calling? Especially you have mentioned listen to people carefully, about that. So share with us what does women can do or in general can do to listen to that calling and listen to what the other people are saying.
Yeah, I think listen to that little voice in your head, ever since probably you were a little girl, a little person, what did that sound like? What were the activities that got you most excited? Today, what's happening on your very best days? What are the activities you just kind of lose yourself in and are so immersed that you lose track of time? A lot of those are clues, kind of pieces of the puzzle that I help my clients kind of put together in their game plans. But they've always been there. There's no surprise. It's just we don't listen to them, especially as we get older. Myself included. I remember being a very curious 8 year old about things like feminism and gender jokes that I didn't think were very funny, for example. And my mom, I was raised by a single mom, and she would always say, I remember as soon as you'd start talking careers, high school age, Julie, your purpose is to help women. I was like, whatever, mom, I'm gonna like go do business and make money and climb this corporate ladder that everyone says you're supposed to do to be successful. And I just remember her when I graduated from college and I, got the corporate gig and was doing that. She's like, what are like, why? Like, okay, I guess if this is what you think you want. And so it's just really funny that she knew all along. And a lot of times the people closest to in our lives see the light, they see that too. They just don't always shine it for us the way that she did for me and hold that mirror up and be like, hey, do you see this? Because I think it's pretty obvious. We're walking around in our own skin a lot. We just don't see what we don't see. We don't know how we come across, or, a lot of times I was like, well, everyone's passionate about this. Like, how could everything now not be about diversity? Because I'm always thinking about it. But that's unique to you. There's something inside you that's unique to you that not everyone else is thinking about. And it's probably always been there since you were little. And so just spending some time reflecting on that. And I know, journaling techniques, certainly vision boarding techniques. There's all sorts of visualization and manifestation techniques I use with my clients. But at its most simplest level, like really thinking about what you want. Like, what is it that gets you excited? What is happening on those best days? And just put pen to paper and visualize it. And I think you'd be surprised by what you see. I check in with myself often on that and kind of think, what is it that I want? Like, where do I see my future? And I have many more years to do this work. It's going to pivot, it's going to change and iterate over time. And I got to keep dialed in on that purpose.
And I think that a couple of important things that you factor in there was this is something we always have it in us, right? Whether or not you purposely look for it or whether or not you ignore it, it's always been there. And I remember that when I made the change from the corporate life into my own business, it was the same thing. And I can tell you, based on what you say, that things that I do today, I immensely enjoyed it. There's a feeling that when you're doing something, you really absolutely enjoy it. And that's a lot of time people ask me how do I like what I do, and I just say that I love what I do. A lot of people don't have a chance to do this, but I guess as long as you dial in early on and purposely listening to what is your calling, chances are you will find it. Otherwise, this is what people usually tell me, you ended up doing things of what other people tell you to do, and you're not going to be happy for that. And Julie, you mentioned a couple of times about creating that game plan. Not to kind of give away too much, but could you tell us about what does that actually mean for people who are either already in the entrepreneurial space or in the corporate ladder that they're moving up? What does having a game plan, what is it, and what does it actually mean for people who wants to move ahead?
Yeah, yeah, no, I appreciate the question. And no, I mean, there's no like secret recipe or secret sauce to this. I mean, I have some ideas based on research I've done over the years with women in particular at that mid-career point. And I think it's very timely right now, seeing the exodus of women in the workforce because of COVID and primary caretaking responsibilities, that we're at another pivot point where we're perhaps stepping backwards in the gender equality conversation. So I think now more than ever, we need to be talking about this and what next looks like for women in the workplace and how we can make workplaces more inclusive. But if I were somebody kind of thinking about what is my career game plan, like where do I want to go? I'm not going to say like, if you've worked in corporate America and done an individual development plan, like, yes, and there's lots of challenges with those lengthy documents and all those boxes to fill out. I like to think of a simple game plan as a one-page document that really answers a couple questions. What am I all about? What's my purpose? Call that your purpose statement. How can you put pen to paper on like who I am and what I stand for? So, I say I'm a speaker and trainer and author focused on facilitating workplace inclusion for all people to feel seen, heard, and belong. Something that people, when I say that, they really understand what it means. I mean, I fully encompass what I do, but then it triggers a conversation, right? So having a clear purpose statement about who you are and what you stand for. And then really building some goals, one, two, or three, no more than three goals, kind of 3-year time horizon here. We're not looking for 5 years, pie in the sky, 1 year, super tactical. But thinking about within 3 years' time, what do I need to do to show that I'm living out that purpose, right? For me, it might be writing new books, it might be new speaking engagements, whatever it is, but it ties to that purpose. And then from there, think about the competencies, the skills, behaviors, attributes that you need to fine tune and maybe spend some time learning about in the form of books or training programs or mentorship to learn about leadership, learn about communication techniques, learn about confidence, whatever it is, those gaps you need to close to live that purpose statement and achieve those goals. And then the last piece is the easy part, the blocking and tackling, the action plan. So I like to think 90-day actions. What are the key things I've got on my radar? Behind me, I have a whiteboard with my 90-day rocks, the things I gotta hit to achieve my goals. And I always like to keep that right in front of me. So I see it, I'm reminded by it, and I know that those are my unshakable priorities. You think about those are kind of the boundaries, the guardrails of your plan to make sure you don't just react to the universe around us. It's really easy to be like yes to everything and then say no to ourselves. But if you proactively defined your priorities, it's a lot easier to say yes to the right things and no to the wrong things.
I like the way that you kind of lay it out, very, very simple, where it is a one-page document, just answer a few questions, right? Not only you have to clearly identify what that purpose is and who you are, what you stand for, and most importantly, have goals. And the goals are not necessarily something not obtainable. It is short, 1 to 3 years time horizons, and you then have to kind of self-assess your inventory, right? And figure out what is the gaps from today to where you want to be. That sounds very, very logical, but I think that one of the things that I've seen often people that fall short is that it's always good to get started, but I think that your action plans actually makes a lot of sense, especially you have the 3 90 days action plans. It is something that I call accountability. You have to hold yourself accountable, and if you are not able to hold yourself accountable, find a mentor, find a coach or somebody help you to do that. Because I think that every single successful business that I've seen or at least work with, lots and lots of business owners, there's one thing in common, and that is that discipline of self accountability is incredibly high. They don't necessarily need people to remind them. They're just an energy to drive toward their success. So thank you very much for sharing that game plan that you have in place. One of the things that you mentioned several times regarding about inclusions and in today's stage where that women have a lot more access in terms of various different tools and techniques and career path. And I know that in financial planning or financial service profession in general is typically a male dominated field. But we also know that more than half of the population are women that has either partners or somebody that they walk into the financial planning or services industry to seek help. And years ago that lots of companies start to realize the importance about learning how to talk to women, learning how to work with women. But I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about the industry has kind of transformed in a way of, it used to be in the 80s and 70s that used to be more of a solo practitioners, one person shop with maybe a couple of assistants. That's very popular. So the startup cost is really, really small. Today, the industry has transformed into more of a team approach where you have a number of the advisors in your practice, sometimes up from 4 to 10 advisors, and sometimes you may have junior partners, a variety of a team, different activities that you get involved in. So as we kind of transition into this team environment, the companies become larger and larger. And many of the folks that are on the call today, I know that they're working in a pretty sizable firms today. Help us understand that when it comes to facilitating positive changes, what will be some practical strategies to consider, especially we are in the field that is in constant change. Not only the technology changes, the client's demands is also changing. Things like last week's GameStop as
Right.
one of those
Timely.
jokes that we have in place. So help us understand, in terms of a team environment, what do we need to do as a leader to facilitate changes?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Yeah, and as so many businesses have consolidated or, gone to that team-based approach, so I appreciate that question. Within the financial services industry, I could see how, yeah, it used to just be like a 1 or 2 person shop, and you didn't have to think about something like leadership and more like leading each
Right,
other.
right,
So it is different, and most businesses are like that now. There's very few solo kind of businesses.
right.
When you think about the team-based approach and why it's so important to have diverse perspectives on your team, because you think about it, women especially make so much of the financial decisions, but are woefully underrepresented from a financial planner perspective. So having more women on your team to provide that perspective, having the perspective of people of color, of diverse perspectives. What we know about the next generation coming into the workforce and the next generation of consumers is they're the most diverse that they've ever been. And that's racially, that's gender, fluidity. It's a lot of different factors. And so they're going to value that diversity, and reflecting that in your team is really important. So thinking about what I teach is inclusive leadership. And it's really so that you're in making sure that everyone on your team feels seen, they feel heard, and they feel like they belong. And I think that sounds very basic to people. For anyone that's familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you remember the pyramid, physiological needs, safety, and then like connection and belonging. It's a sad place in a lot of corporate America where people don't feel like they can bring their full selves to work. So as a leader, it's really your job to empower people, meet them where they're at, understand them, empathize with them, listen to them, mirror the vulnerability and the empathy that you'd like to see from them that you're representing as well as a leader. And leaders have to go first with some of this hard stuff. So if we want to get the best from our team, they have to feel a sense of belonging. They have to feel that they're not hiding a part of their identity to get their job done. And that happens a lot. 50% of people in the gay community are closeted at work, for example. A lot of women, myself included, working in masculine industries like financial planning and construction, I very much embodied a male persona to just get through the day of work. And I didn't even know I was doing it at the time. But that's not good for business. That's not good for the team if we're spending mental energy having to pretend to be a different version of ourselves. So, what I talk about a lot in speaking and training with leaders is how to lead like an ally, how to be there for people that are different than you. And this is especially important for the white male majority group that runs most of corporate America and most of the financial planning industry. They're part of the solution. It's not the problem, white men. It's really that we need all people engaged in this conversation if we're going to move forward, especially those with power and privilege and access to wealth. And so this is a really important, timely conversation to think about how can we get all voices included, and how can we mirror our customer base? And that's through inclusive leadership.
A couple of things that I picked up here is if I think back, looking at when you're talking about feeling the sense of belongings and things like that. Yeah, you're right. When I was in the corporate life, part of the reason I left certain corporate job was because I didn't feel like I belonged there. Um, but it took me years to realize that the belongingness for me, at least for me, not necessarily everyone, is that I think that maybe for women in some situation, that if I didn't have enough confidence in myself, I don't think that I would be feeling the way of belongingness or ability to listen and with empathies. So can you talk a little bit about what is it with confidence and this workplace leadership and empathy? How does that actually all jives in terms of you making yourself feel like you belong to a place and you don't actually need permission from anybody else? So help me understand, what is there any correlation in terms of your own confidence level, and if there is, what could we do about that?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a degree to where women and people that are, you know, left out of conversations to lean in, right? The Sheryl Sandberg's work, right? We lean in confidence and have the confidence to speak up and advocate for yourself. But to your point, if a workplace isn't welcoming of you as a full human and you don't feel like you belong, you're probably not going to do that, right? So there's this like chicken and egg problem that we have. If you don't have an inclusive workplace, you're probably not going to tell the workplace that it's not inclusive, right? Because even if you are confident about speaking up, you're probably going to think, well, it's not going to change anyway. So why even bother? I'm already one step out. So I might as well just like get out of here safely. with my, dignity intact.
Right, right.
But I do think, if you think your workplace is conducive to change, if there are certain leadership members, maybe not the full leadership team, but certain leaders that really get it, that have demonstrated they might want to be an ally for you or for people like you, getting their attention. And I think what we learned in 2020 is a real wake-up call between the pandemic and Black Lives Matter and all of the events and accumulation is that people are bringing their full selves to work, right? We're in our homes working. Of course, there's no like boundary that we used to like cross the threshold for work and like check out. That I don't think ever really happened to begin with, but there was this, physical separation. Now everything's mismatched together, and our values for social justice, for example, aren't going to leave when we step into our Zoom room. So think about how could you demonstrate to others, signal to others, like, I'm a safe place to come and talk to about this? And also, your point about confidence is think about what if I don't say anything? Like, what if I don't do anything? Like, am I okay with things not changing or things continuing the way they are now? If not, like that's on me, right? So we all have a role in this, and to say inaction is the solution and just waiting for things to change, is the definition of insanity. So we've all got to do our part. But I think this is the shortcut, is finding somebody that can be an ally for you, finding somebody that you can advocate for and that can advocate with you, right? If we do this work together and we're supportive together, white voices with black voices, men with women, people across ethnic groups, when we do this work together, it's just so much more powerful and so much better. It's just so much more well received.
And I totally agree there. And I remember you mentioned about our next generation. If I look at my daughter's generation, they're very, very diverse. In their eyes, there's really not necessarily the white, the brown, they don't necessarily see all that because they grew up in a very diverse, with a diverse friends and environment. And so they actually have a different type of perspective versus the our generation. You're a little bit younger, much younger than me. In our generation, we're still trying to figure it out how to work with the younger generation. So would you mind to talk a little bit about in terms of, we know that an organization ultimately going to bring in younger generation into your team, not necessarily just for the succession purpose, but for also succession of the customers, right? Your clients and customer are going to get younger. And if you are seeing your clients getting older, it's not necessarily good for a business from a value perspective. So would you mind to share a little bit about, in terms of younger generations, how do we listen and how do we invite them to participate in the day-to-day team activities?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. And, part of this is I'm a millennial, I think by definition, kind of Gen X by some definition. So I'm on the cusp. So I can kind of step into both worlds and understand this a little bit. But Gen Z is a little baffling for me as well, because they were at the height of immigration. They see things so diverse. They have that diverse mindset growing up with kids of all different skin colors and ethnicities. So at the same time, though, what we know historically is each generation has kind of kicked the can to the next generation to solve this diversity problem. And so it's not always the next generation that has to undo the work of previous generations. It's not really fair to put that on them. So I think, though, to answer your question on how to engage this next generation and part of solving the problem is really looking to them of, what are your perspectives? Like, what can we do to make this easier? What things have worked well for you? And I think if only more senior leaders were willing to reverse mentor, right? Spend more time with young people, understanding their mindset, we would learn so much more about how they've shifted their mindset, or maybe just things that are innate and natural to them that we can embed in our thinking. And so much of my research, it always goes back to these simple tenets of inclusive leadership, some of which I've mentioned before: vulnerability, empathy, curiosity is a huge, listening, and like really listening, asking good questions that you don't know the answers to, coaching, mentoring. These are when inclusive leaders almost do so naturally that they don't even realize they're doing it or don't even realize that it's different. That a lot of times when you talk with these people, they're like, oh, everyone does that. Like, I don't know. I wish more people were doing it, but you're kind of an anomaly. And so I think if we were just willing to listen more to each other, and rather than like how our brain looks at difference, our brain loves categories, right? It loves to put things like your black, brown, white, right? We want to know where someone's from, which is not always a good question to ask somebody because it signals that they don't belong here, right? And so how your brain has this curiosity to put people into a category based on a pattern of which it's lived through before. The challenge with that biased thinking, while it was once very helpful for survival to know if someone was a part of your tribe or not, in today's world, it's signaling, are you one of me or are you someone else? Right. And sometimes if we let that bias trigger in our brains, we might treat people differently based on their skin color, based on their age, based on their gender identity, whatever it may be at hand. And we might make a lot of assumptions about that person we're not even sure are true. So I love just to intervene with my own thinking and say, before I make an assumption about somebody, where they're from, or their English abilities, if they're not white, or if they're black. A lot of times people make assumptions about they're good at sports. Just these little like subtle microaggressions that our brain just naturally does without us even thinking. Rather than making that assumption, just slowing down my brain a little bit and asking, well, how do I know that's true? What information do I have to make that assumption, right? And a lot of times I'm like, oh, I don't know that's true, right? I've got to check myself a little bit. And that's what I think we can get really good at doing across generations, is checking each other's bias, challenging each other's bias. As we get older, our brain's pathways hardwire, right? Those pathways that have been crossed over the years, the more that we see people that look this way and behave this way, the more we think like all people like that must be this way, right? So we really generalize about labels on things. So it's almost like this hardwiring in our brains when I'm doing diversity training has to almost be undone. You almost have to unlearn some things and then relearn. And our brains don't love that, right? Our brains, like the plasticity slows down as we get older. So it's not that you can't do it. It's just, it takes more mental energy. And if you think about who's leading corporate America and who's leading most financial planning firms of a certain demographic age, right? This is why we're kind of hitting an uphill battle. But if only, to your point, we engaged this newer generation and their thinking around this, I think we can make it easier on everybody.
And I think that as you're talking and I'm thinking about when I was younger, I absolutely don't like to talk to my dad because he's always judging. And I think that I found that today that I have to consciously remind myself, please do not judge, ask questions and listen. It's hard thing to do. It's not necessarily something very natural. So I think especially that I grew up in corporate America, and then I'm working with all these type A successful business owners today, that there's a certain level of judging, and there's a certain level that my clients are expecting me to give a direct answer and give a direct directions. So I think it's hard, and for me is terribly hard, and I have to be very, very conscious about, number one, not to judge, and in terms of listening, sometimes and I think that this takes years of practice. Yes, I'm listening, but I may not actually listen. So I think you mentioned about asking good questions, affirmation, asking good questions. Those are techniques that actually help you listen well. And I think the most difficult things that you mentioned to do is unlearn something, right? Because it's really hard work. I remember I have to kind of listen to one of a much younger, like in the early 20s situation, that listening to a particular financial situation. Number one, I have to really just stand aside, not to judge, number one. And number two is unlearning the process of talking to them is really difficult. Can you share with us what will be one or two techniques that you can help us go through something that we can unlearn and still gain some good skills?
Yeah. Well, one of the first techniques that I mentioned the words unconscious bias before. So anybody that hasn't taken the unconscious bias assessment, it's on Harvard's website. It's implicit.harvard.edu. It's free, it's anonymous, it's based on research by Harvard and other leading universities. So it's a good tool.
I've done it. Just want to let you know.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's
It's cool.
it's a little painful, but it's not like you don't have to tell anybody. No one's going to see your results.
Right, right.
It is a fascinating conversation to have with somebody. So there's like 12 different categories, race and gender, of course, age, sexual orientation, some other areas. So, I always encourage people take a couple. And you might have bias in some areas, might in others. Everyone has bias in at least one of the categories. That's how our brains work. So that's a technique because you can't be aware of your bias. You can't intervene with it if you're not aware of it, right? So when I took that, a lot of people, when they take the gender one, they associate women with caretaking and men as providers, for example. So if that shows up for you in the workplace, you might make an assumption about a man being a provider and a woman being a caretaker, and you might promote men and women differently. You might give pay increases differently based on that assumption. So our bias plays into our behavior if we're not careful. Um, when I took it, I actually assume my brain assumes the opposite. I was raised by a single mom, and I'm the breadwinner in my family as a woman. So I assume men are caretakers and women are providers, which is only 5% of the population thinks this way. But that's kind of my lived experience. It doesn't make me perfect. It actually, my bias will show up opposite. If men aren't participating, I think, equally in caretaking, or women don't have a career outside of the home, sometimes I might have to check myself on my bias for that. Racially, I have a bias towards assuming white people are in power and Black people are oppressed. Again, based on my lived experiences, I have very rarely, I would say only a handful of times, have I experienced working with a person of color as a leader. And that's all too often the case for white people. 75% of white people grow up in white dominated communities. We are still very segregated. So it's not my fault, right, that I have racial bias, but it is my responsibility to be aware of it and to make sure that my actions don't result in a way to make people feel othered or marginalized or not included that aren't of white skin like me. And the second thing I'd share, the implicit bias association test is definitely something tangible y'all can do. It takes 10 minutes. You can do it on a smartphone. It's a pattern test. So you can't fool it, by the way. The second thing you can do, and I think this is really important for the work that I'm doing now that I'm most proud of, is having this conversation with children. Whether you have children like you do, or you have little people in your life, nieces, nephews, whoever you spend time with, the earlier, just like we're talking about undoing things, the earlier we start this conversation, the better it's going to be for everyone. I have a 6-year-old and a 3-month-old, and a bonus 17-year-old stepdaughter. So all sorts of age ranges, all different conversations. Very simple for the 3-month-old. Just really not a conversation yet. But the 6-year-old, we're reading books with diverse characters, and then we're very conscious of the toys we buy, the skin colors, the abilities, the gender representation. We do not buy books that don't have diversity in them. We don't buy toys that make women look weak, for example, because her brain's picking all this up and she's already saying things about boys do this and girls do that. And she's very curious about race, but is not exposed a lot to kids of color. So we really have to be intentional about that and talk about that. So I think if you have the ability to talk with young people about diversity, you'll find they just say it just how it is. Like, we learn these filters and these biases through the course of our life. And about fifth grade is when we know that you can have a very meaningful conversation about something like what happened last summer, for example. That was a very difficult conversation with my daughter because her brain just doesn't quite understand this yet. She just sees it as wrong, right? But at fifth grade, they have the mental awareness to understand hate and bias and different treatment for different people, and you can really have a conversation. And honestly, that's where I learned the most about inclusion. Like, we already know how to include each other. This is part of our human survival, that we need each other. We're a connected social species. it's again through media, through through these events, through these things that we see that we unlearn this natural force of inclusion. So those be some techniques that I would try if you're willing.
And I think that none of that is easy when, especially someone at my age. And the reason I say that was when I took that test, the Harvard test that you were talking about, I actually tested, from a preference perspective, I still preference people with a lighter skin in terms of how I make decision. That was something I didn't know. And then after I thought about it, it made all sense because I was born and raised in Taiwan, even though we don't have various different type of it's all Chinese environment. How could it be possible in that way? But in our culture, we still prefer to see people in the lighter skin in upper social status. And so it actually does make sense afterwards. I realized that there's just something unhidden that is planted early on in me, and I have to unlearn that. Otherwise, it would be not good in terms of working with anyone, not just a younger generation.
Well, and
So thank you
people of
very.
color
Mhm.
are just
Yeah.
as likely as people
Yes.
like white people to have the bias. Same with women
Right.
against women. So we learn this through representation, right? And so who
Right.
you were exposed to as leaders and decision makers, for me, it was all white men. And
Right.
still, who writes the checks for me to speak and train in companies? White men. So I
Yeah.
still have to be careful. I
Yeah.
default to that they must be the decision maker.
And it's very interesting that unless you run into it, you probably don't really know. But I'm so glad that I took the test, because at least I learned a little bit about myself, and I know that to unlearn it is quite difficult. And that's not kind of switch gear for a moment regarding about. I'm gonna try to go down to the next page where we've talked about the inclusion leaders. I wanted to kind of touch base on a lot of these when you were walking through some of these techniques to have in a team-based environment. I couldn't help it to just write down culture, because that's really a type of culture that you as a leader wanted to reflect and set in your environment. So what could we do in terms of setting that presence and setting that inclusion culture? Are there any techniques or tips that you can share? So as we kind of promote this profession of having a lot more inclusion in terms of various different type, personality, passion, and all that, what can we do as a leader in terms of the culture side?
Yeah, I think a few things like inclusion starts from the top. So your senior leadership team, whoever's leading your organization, has to be passionate about this. They have to have a consistent, intentional approach to this. So when I look for an inclusive culture, I often ask, tell me about your senior leadership team's engagement. And that might be the owner at some smaller financial firms. That could be a team of people at larger firms. But I often ask, how are you intentionally talking about diversity and inclusion? How is it threaded in the way that we do business? How are we consistently showing up? A lot of times that means training. A lot of times that means communication planning. That means when something like Black Lives Matter happens and George Floyd's death happens, that we don't just talk about it once. We don't make this donation and this pledge, or, a lot of the activities that were just kind of lip service last summer. We're doing this consistently. We're talking about it in the fall. We're talking about Black History Month right now. We're going to talk about Women's History Month next month. By the way, we're going to talk about it all year because it's not just a month exercise. So to me, senior leadership team engagement, intentionality, and consistency are really hallmarks of an inclusive culture.
And I think that oftentimes that it may not fall, the responsibility may not fall completely in the leadership. I think if the leader were to solicit help from the team, right? Because I don't think anybody would have all the solutions. It's probably not possible. But if you could possibly solicit help from the team, see what, and that's just my, my in my little world, my imagination. I would assume that a
Yeah, they
lot of
need help
people
for
together.
sure. Yep. Yep.
A lot
We're
of
all in
people
it together.
together,
But you
right?
know what it's like for your boss to say something is important and then not actually show that it's important, right? Like that's the
Right,
whole problem when senior leadership is like, yeah, sure, that's important, but get your work done.
right. Get your work done, and then, but you still have to be conscious. I would assume that I wouldn't possibly have all the answer, and then I truly need to kind of listen and get everyone involved. But at the same time, you're right. The work still needs to get done. For example, today I have one of my team member ask me about, do I need to go to that diversity meeting? And
Right,
I'm like, well, it is really entirely up to you. No one is making you to go. If you think you're going to benefit from it, you
right.
should participate. But again, is that part of work? Not really, but not that is required. Is not required.
Right. Yeah, it's
But
this
that's part
balance
of the
of what's
training, right?
important.
Yeah, there's things that you kind of trying to juggle all the time without not necessarily addressing the most important thing, servicing our clients.
I agree.
Um, so thank you so much. We have been talking quite long about all these various different techniques and possible tools that can help everyone. If there's one advice that you could provide to people in the financial planning or financial service profession, what would that be?
Yeah, I mean, I think about what customers you want to serve. Think about what kind of clients you want to be attracting. Think about the future of your workforce. What does that look like? What do they behave like? What ethnicities, what genders, what sexual orientations like might they be? And again, what we know about this next generation being very diverse, it's likely that who you want to do business with in the future is probably different than who you are as a team. And so I call this like mirroring your customer base, mirroring the communities of which you want to serve. This is, I think, a real pain point for organizations to think about. Okay, we got to get better if we want to serve this next generation and have the best employees and do business with reflecting, who society is. Okay, that means we need to do some work, right? And I think that's really a really nice starting point for not there's business case data out there. You can look at Harvard Business Review, for example. There's dozens of articles on the ROI of diversity training and diverse leadership teams. But really the crux of it is the human case, thinking about why this is important, like why this is critically important for our organization to be inclusive. And I think when you really reflect on who you want to serve and what they might look like and behave like in the future, you're probably not there. Right. And so what can you do to address those gaps? And that's really the conversation we've had is all about tools to be curious and be an ally and to be an inclusive leader, because that's the kind of places that diverse talent wants to work.
And would it be selfish to say that a lot of us that really hate to spend too much money on training because it does take time, but I have to argue that it does pay off at some point. Are there any kind of I like the phrase that you mentioned about mirror your customer base, and you do have to work toward that. Would you recommend any type of um, training in terms of the frequency of it? What will be a right amount of training that a
Yeah.
company could provide?
Yeah, it totally depends on your size and your culture, right? So, like, one of the programs we have is called Lead Like an Ally, based on my book that you shared up front, Lead Like an Ally. And it's kind of a 12-step process. It starts with self awareness and it goes through all of the different dimensions of diversity, like race and gender and LGBTQ and unconscious bias, and some of the things we talked about with leadership style, all the way to how to build sustainable systems around diversity and inclusion. And so it's kind of like a micro learning course, 5 minutes a week, with a workbook to follow along with some thought provoking exercises. So, I mentioned that as an online course that I think any leader could take at any business size. And it's really great when I have some financial planning organizations that are taking that collectively together in small teams and then huddling in on like, what did you learn? What are you struggling with? Where are you doing well? So the self-paced learning that people can do in their own privacy of their computers with resources. It shouldn't take more than 5 minutes a week, but it could take more if you want to pursue some of the optional resources we have as well. So that's one. A lot of my corporate clients that are, big financial planning firms, bigger corporations, to have a monthly lunch and learn or a quarterly inclusion activity is very normal. I don't like to use the word normal. It's very often the case, maybe better said. So that frequency, the length, all that good stuff, that's really determined by your culture and how you support diversity inclusion, how you support training. And meeting people where they're at is really important. So I like to first talk about allyship and why it's important to be an ally, what it means to be an ally and how to do it. And then sprinkle in techniques, just like we have very much in this interview. The techniques is important, but the mindset is even more important to get the mindset up front.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that really the frequency really depending upon the culture that you want to set as a leader of your firm. And the mindset is probably by far the more important. When I first came into this industry as a career changer, I had study group. And that study group is precisely what you say. It's a lunch and learn. And that study group that we have oftentimes have outside people coming in. So all of us are learning something new. And so I do really encourage, and I encourage people to set up their own study group. You can have a study group within your own firm. And even if your leader in the firm isn't providing the training, that doesn't tell you that you don't have the right to do that. You could still set up your own study group to do that. And I found study group is really very powerful way to extend and build your allies out there, because those folks that are within the study group could further provide you additional resources that may surprise you in the future. And so Julie had put it in a group chat box to share.
Yeah, I just put a resource list that might be
a resource
helpful. Speaking of study groups, yeah, we're working on it's ever updated. So I just put the latest version of a resource list to lead like an ally. So if you're interested, dig into those. It has podcasts, movies, books, all sorts of do it at your own pace activities.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. We're so glad to have you for the Next Gen Mentoring Forum. What an informative session. We should probably have you back sometime in the future, talk more specifically about other specific sections that we touched base on today. So thank you so much. And I wanted to thank California Lutheran University School of Management Financial Planning Program for sponsoring today's Next Gen Mentoring Forum. California Lutheran University School of Management, we offer MBA in financial planning that helps financial advisors pursue a leadership position and grow their financial planning practice by deploying advanced financial planning techniques, effective client communication, client counseling, streamlined practice management, as well as the fintech technology. Please sign up for our info session for more information. Our Next Gen Mentoring Forum session is on February the 16th, 2021 at 1 p.m. Please join me to interview our financial experts, Jennifer Baccarella. She is going to help us understand how to leverage center of influence and referrals to grow your business. Till then, thank you very much for everyone, and we'll see you at the Next Gen Mentoring Forum on February 16th. And thank you, Julie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take good care.
Okay, appreciate it. Bye.